have a guest with me for the rest of the program. He's going to give us his personal take on the news and issues of the day. He is, of course, the political affairs commentator, Arise News analyst, and head of mass communications at Bayes University in Abuja, Professor Abiodun Adeniyi. Thank you very much indeed for joining us again.
Thank you very much, John.
And we were talking to Bismarck Rewani. The big issue in Nigeria today, of course, the introduction of these redesigned, or we should say recolored notes, and the idea again of reminding people of the cash withdrawal limits that are going to be coming into effect. The Senate earlier raising some concern, questions about how effective the campaign is of informing Nigerians about this, especially for people living in the rural areas. Is that an issue of genuine concern in your assessment?
Well, first, thank you, Charles. But first, let me just remark that the very erudite economist, Mr.
Bismarck Rewani,
was softly critical of the policy, and of course, very intelligently so as well. You know, given his very rich pedigree when it matters economics. You know, so I wasn't really surprised. You know, but what was slightly surprising for me is that, you know, I used to remember that sometimes in 2019 he was appointed alongside others, alongside some other eggheads, as a member of President Buhari's economic advisory team. You know, we had people like Professor Soludo, Professor Odeojowu, and of course I think it was chaired by Professor Salami, Salami. You know, so it now made me to be asking the question: what became of that advisory team? Because if we had that kind of team in place, with the many important points that Bismarck was raising, you know, so those points should probably have influenced the policy decision. You know, do not forget that economic matters, you know, are largely dependent on variables, you know, and those variables have to be informed. You know, the information also should also come from critical empiricism. You know, there has to have very solid precedents. You know, and of course he was very lavish, you know, in bringing out some of these details, including the ones that has to do with contemporary issues, giving examples from across the world. I would have thought that those rich views, you know, should have helped, you know, the monetary policy chieftains in the central bank, you know, before in advance of this final decision. You know, then where did the president also not think about consulting this advisory team, or is he moribund? Like most things in Nigeria, because most things are celebrated in this country with fanfare, then afterwards they just go moribund, nothing else happens. You know, so what comes to mind is that maybe consultation was not necessarily foolproof ahead of this decision.
Well, I think you're right about
even though the CBN has the sole authority, like the other very brilliant professor told us, you know, the one who was deputy governor of the central bank before.
Yeah, you mean Kingsley Moore?
Kingsley Moore told us that the CBN has, you know, the sole authority to print notes, and of course, been a while that notes have been printed. But even then, it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some level of consultation in a situation where economic decisions may not necessarily be cast in stone. You know, subject to so many variables, like I alluded to earlier on.
That's a very good point. And in fact, to attempt to answer the question you raised there about whether or not there were consultations with that economic, because they're essentially an advisory council.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I remember, and I won't mention names of which ones, but I remember a number of them complaining quite vociferously that their advice was never taken.
Do you know, I remember in the period of our President Olusegun Obasanjo, you know, I mean, Obasanjo is one that bears his mind. It doesn't matter who talks is God. He actually made this point that he was swearing in some advisors, including the late Ujoma Luke. I said, look, I'm appointing you as advisors. It doesn't mean that I'm going to take your advice. You know? And the fact that I don't take your advice does not mean you should stop advising me.
Yeah.
Because if you stop advising me because I'm not taking your advice, I will sack you. So I think we have a lesson to learn from there, that sometimes it may not be okay, we may not be too expectant that the advices, as the case could be, will be taken. But of course, we know that these people are experts, and there was a reason that influenced you're picking them in the first instance. You know, their expertise should not necessarily be taken for granted. And that's why part of the problem we're having, really, where technocracy has been undermined, you know, where people who have the right information have been downplayed, where merit, you know, is discountenanced. And of course, it is part of the bane of our development, you know. People who have the right knowledge, you know, are undermined. Everything is being politicized. Everything is about prerogatives, about It's about priority. You know, it's about reward, loyalty, simple loyalty as against expertise and skills and know-how, which is something that is very critical to development. And there are so many examples that we can cite from around the world. You know, how expertise has influenced development. Nobody is saying that you should not consider political patronage, but of course, it shouldn't be in the dominant percentage. But what we're having around us is that we are seeing that political patronage is actually what is predominant, you know, in the determination of who holds very critical position. And we can even see them around, you know, critical government positions, you know, where decisions should have been funded on requisite knowledge. It's just, you know, we just see lame duck, you know, lazy thinking, so to say, you know, determining policy directions, which is really unfortunate. I think nation building, Charles, is a continuous process. It is not too late for us to learn, and of course, another dispensation is coming. It is hoped that you know, we'll continue the learning process. We'll build from there and continue the learning process rightly.
That's a good point. And just to mention the fact that because we had started talking about, you know, consultations and whether or not the economic advisory team are advising the government, or even whether the central bank, the monetary committee takes advice and so on. The central bank has pointed out that it is not inflexible when it comes to this, and therefore that it is willing to review the measures if there is a need to do so. And we also know that the House of Representatives has actually summoned the governor of the central bank to come and speak to them about these monetary measures and how it's supposed to checkmate inflation and all the rest of it. But the other issue that came up in the program today was the issue of litigation, politicians going to court against other politicians. We saw that the case of Bola Ahmed Tinubu, an attempt to disqualify him. But I mean, without talking about that specific case, I wondered if you could give us your sense of how litigation in this country seems to come up excessively during election periods. And also, see, as Toby Shoni said, I mean, it could go anyway because the money is an element.
Yeah, I had it very clearly. I think it has to do again with the culture of our politics. You know, our politics is yet to develop such that we'll see electioneering or contestation as something that should supposed to be driven by public interest. And most of the time, we emphasize itself as against the others. Whereas this is contrary to what the politicians themselves mouth. Most of the time, they tell us that my people have asked me to come and do this, whereas it is their own primary interest. And sometimes they're also die-harded in the way they are pursuing it. And that's why when results are declared, most of the time they will disagree. If I say taking for granted thing that 95% of them are likely to disagree with election outcome. And that's why they overburden the judiciary. And I think it's something that may continue for some time until we have a reorientation where we are less die-harded about political contestation, realizing that it's something that should be driven for the good of the public. And if you are driven by the good of the public, I beg your pardon, there's an extent to which you should be vociferous about it, because the public are not asking you to go to court. You are the one taking that decision.
Yeah, but of course it's not just the politicians. But it's also the lawyers and the...
but of course, if somebody does not want to go to court, the lawyer will not just come and say, okay, let me take your case. So those are the issues we should begin to look at. You know, and again, I think, you know, government, being in government in this country or in less developed countries, can be very, very lucrative, you know. So, I mean, we've seen people 6 months after getting into government, they become very wealthy, and so it remains very, very attractive. So when somebody loses an election, for instance, it just feels that we have lost an opportunity to explode financially, and he wants to go the whole log fighting it. So it's a political culture that will have to change, maybe with time. But all hopes are not lost, Charles.
On that note, I want to thank you very much indeed. Professor Abiodun Adeniyi is a political affairs commentator, Arise News analyst, and head of mass communications at Bayes University in Abuja. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
That's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and Lagos. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.